When Darren and I were growing up on the farm, our job was hogs. We had to manage the hogs, and that was lots of fun, wasn't it, Darren?
That means we get to scoop hog manure in the morning. We get to scoop manure when we got back from school at night.
On the weekends, Sundays,
there's a lot of scooping. Then we get to spread it out in fields. I mean, it's a pretty fun thing.
So when you drive onto our farmyard, you would absolutely smell those hogs. And what our dad would say is, well, boys, that's the smell of money. But you know what? Here's what I've learned over the years. That's not the smell of money. That's the smell of lost money. The point is, if you can smell manure, you've got nutrients that are potentially going up into the air, especially nitrogen. We worry a lot about ammonia out there. Well, what is ammonia? It's got some nitrate in it. We don't want to lose that. We want to tie that up. We want to bind it to our soil. We don't want it going anywhere else other than in our soil. That's what we want to talk about today.
All right, so when we think about the manure that's getting spread on farms across the country, you may be asking, well, why are farmers spreading it now? Why don't they spread it later? Or why don't they spread it next spring? In many cases, livestock operations have lagoons or have tanks or have pits that are getting full, and they need to get some of those nutrients out in the field. Now's a good time to get that done. There's still time to get it out in the soil before things freeze up. And that's really the key here, is we want to apply the manure before we have frozen ground to avoid having some issues. Like Brian said, we don't want to lose any of the manure or lose any of the nutrients in the manure or cause any environmental issues. The biggest way we can do that is if we do apply it over frozen ground. Now, if we happen to get some moisture and we have that warm day, that moisture could run off and the manure has not had a chance to bind into that soil.
Okay, so here are our top 3 tips. Number 1, you've got to do it before you have frozen ground. Number 2, we want to inject that manure. We don't like manure left on the soil surface. We want that manure injected. And I know some people will lay it on the soil surface and work it in. If you're going to do that, work it in deep. Okay, we don't want it just worked in an inch or something like that, because now you've got all your phosphorus in that top inch of soil. That's not a good thing. And then the third thing is consider using some type of stabilizer. So there are many companies out there that sell nitrogen stabilizers. There are also companies that sell products for phosphorus. So one good example is More Than Manure, that can help prevent your nitrogen loss. It's a nitrogen stabilizer, but then it also can help your phosphorus so that doesn't get tied up in the soil, so that can be more available for this next crop. Oh, I guess I should really throw in one 4th tip too. That's this. Make sure that you're testing your soil and your manure. We don't want you over applying manure, just like we don't want you over applying any nutrient out there. What we've learned on our own farm is we're way ahead to cut the rate down on manure and then supplement with commercial fertilizers so we can spread that manure over more acres, because we only have a little bit of manure and lots of acres. So if you're in that situation, spread it out over more ground, supplement with commercial fertilizer, and usually you're better off. But make sure you're testing.
Well, the other thing, Brian, about adding some commercial fertilizer to the equation is just to even things out. Many times with manure, we see fields that end up being just a little bit up and down because the fertility value is not exactly the same all the way through that manure, and maybe the spread isn't exactly the same. Putting out commercial fertilizer for a portion of the program really evens things out a little bit, so we take away some of those problems.
Here's the other way that evens it out, Darren, because in a lot of cases we'll find, like the manure that we get, okay, that might be really high in potassium, but it doesn't have a whole lot of phosphorus. So if guys put out there enough to cover their phosphorus need, well, they probably put 3 times as much potassium as they actually needed. So what we're trying to say is we want you to put the right amount out for the crop, not a ridiculous, crazy amount, so you're going to have environmental issues and that kind of thing. We want you to have everything balanced, so a lot of times what that means is the combination of manure and commercial fertilizer.
The other drawback of over-applying manure is salt. In many cases when we're applying manure, there's quite a bit of salt that's in that manure. And if we over-apply, we can really damage our soils and our crops for years to come. So take a look at what the salt content is when you get your manure tested for nutrients, and then don't over-apply it. When we look at pounds of salt per acre, how much can you really tolerate? Well, we get that question all the time. It depends on what crop you're placing out there. It depends on what your drainage is and what your soil situations are. So it's going to vary from area to area and crop to crop. I would just say this, when you look at the salt that you're applying, let's just say, for example, your manure had 300 pounds per acre of salt that's going to be in the spread that you're going to put out there. I would just think of it this way. You put all the fertility out. Would you also like to put 300 pounds of salt on your ground? No, I wouldn't. I don't want much salt at all. Well, then cut back your rate of manure so you don't exceed how much salt your ground can tolerate and so you don't damage your crop or soils.
Okay, when it comes to the application of this manure, like we say, we really like to have it injected, and where personally I like to have it injected is deeper. The main reason why is because phosphorus today is the #1 water quality issue we have in the United States. And unless you way overdo it for phosphorus isn't moving in your soil, okay? So if you put it down in that 6 to 12 inch range, especially in heavy soils, it's pretty well locked in there forever until a crop uses it up. Or maybe a weed, but hopefully we're killing those weeds, right? Well, anyway, my point here is I want you to test your soil. And what I'd suggest doing, even on a little bit of ground, is test every 3 inches going down. Test the top 3 inches, the next 3, the next 3, the next 3. My guess is almost all your fertilizers in the top 3 inches. Okay, well, if it's in the top 3 inches, why put more there? Put more down deeper to lead your roots down deeper. You're going to make your crop a lot more drought tolerant, and you're also going to prevent environmental issues because phosphorus, for the most part, doesn't move in the soil. Again, unless you're 10 or 50 times overdoing it. We just don't have any issues as long as you're putting the right rate on.
The other thing I'd like to mention is when you're getting the manure sample analyzed for nutrients, get a complete analysis. There's a lot more in that manure than just NP and K. We'd like to see what those are because that's going to impact your entire fertility program for your farm.
Well, once again, when we talk about the entire fertility program for the farm, manure is a great way to go. If you have access to manure, you're gonna love it, but just make sure you test it, test your soil, don't overdo it. Supplement with some commercial fertilizer and chances are things are gonna turn out great. And remember that smell of manure is not the smell of money, it's the smell of lost money.
Well, the other thing with manure we hear a lot is, hey, if I put manure out, there's a lot of fertility out there and possibly even some weed seeds in the manure. Our weed of the week is probably not one of those weeds that is common in manure, but we still need to get it under control. We'll show you how later in the show.